And welcome back in to SEC Overdrive, powered by 3 Point Stance Magazine. You can follow 3 Point Stance on Twitter at 3psmag.com. You can follow myself on Twitter at Sam W. Foreman. Colin sitting this segment out as I interview a longtime friend of mine and Colin's, current contributor with Saturday Down South, Jordan Dajani. You can follow him on Twitter at JD3. Jordan, the very first guest on SEC Overdrive. Thank you for spend some time with us tonight.
Yes, sir, absolutely. Anytime I get to sit down and talk some SEC football, it's always a pleasure.
Well, I didn't give you a heads up on this question, but it just kind of hit me, so I'm curious. Notice your first season was Saturday Down South, so what's it like working for a organization for the first 2 weeks of the SEC season that focuses solely on the SEC?
You know, man, I love it. I don't think there's another site out there that does as good of a job as Saturday Down South does. With their stories and with their content. As we know, we live in a 24/7 news cycle. There's always different kind of news coming through the wire. When you cover 14 SEC teams, whether it's press conferences, injuries, big matchups, previewing the big matchups, analytical pieces on your favorite team, or how your favorite former college players are doing in the NFL, Saturday Down South absolutely covers it all. So working with a big brand name like them has absolutely been a joy so far.
Well, I'm glad it's working out well for you, man, and I know you've written some great pieces so far and definitely a wide variety of topics on all things to do with the SEC. Let's head down to Tuscaloosa to start off with. We're 2 weeks in to this quarterback experiment down there in Tuscaloosa. It didn't look so good using both quarterbacks against Louisville. Last week against an inferior opponent in Arkansas State, it looked much better. Part because both quarterbacks had a very solid day. But going forward, what should Alabama do with this quarterback situation?
You know, I think it's very simple. I mean, this topic has been absolutely talked to death, but here's the deal. The answer is Tua. And I think that was very clear from the first game, honestly. I think everyone would agree with me on that. What's tough is that if Alabama continues to blow people out, you're going to continue to see Jalen Hurts. And if I'm Hurts, I have a decision to make, because with the new redshirt rule, if he plays in more than 4 games, then he automatically loses a year of eligibility. If I'm Hurts, I would want to keep that year if possible, so I can go to my new team to play for more than one season. Right now, he's up to 2 games, so it's interesting to see, how he's going to handle the situation. But if I'm Saban, I think it's very clear that Tua is the answer right now.
Since you brought it up, what do you make of the reports that surfaced earlier this week, late last week, that Hurts has a agreement in place with Alabama to where if he's not the starter, he won't play in more than 4 games so that he can redshirt?
I don't know if that's going to happen or not. Like I said, if Alabama continues to blow out teams, you're going to put your backup quarterback in, and right now it's Jalen Hurts. It's going to be interesting to see if that report is true and if they kind of hold to that. But if I'm Hurts, I'm going to have a tough time sitting this season out, obviously. He's a competitor. He's a good kid. He wants to see time on the field. So it will be interesting to see how this plays out. But keeping him off the field and kind of giving him that extra year of eligibility to wherever school he wants to go to next year would be really good for him. And I think it would be a good gesture by Alabama as well, because he's done so much for that team as a starter.
And especially with, I think you've got to say, would be nice of Alabama to handle his exit properly, since they didn't really handle it well this summer with this entire quarterback controversy that Nick Saban created. Let's head to the East and let's talk Kentucky, Florida. Kentucky snaps a 31-year losing streak to Florida. What are your overall thoughts on the Cats finally ending that streak to the Gators?
Yeah, it was pretty unreal for a couple of reasons. I was watching that game and just waiting to see how Kentucky was going to blow it. First of all, Benny Snell Jr. is one of the best running backs in America. He is still not getting enough credit, which is insane. 175 yards on 27 carries on Saturday is pretty wild. One other thing is that Terry Wilson played much better than he did in Week 1. 151 yards and a couple touchdowns. Kentucky had a really bad Week 1 against Central Michigan. I think they're only up 1 point at halftime at home. And I was almost ready to throw in the towel on their season, which is crazy because it's just Week 1. But again, here we are. Kentucky has finally broken the streak. And, that story with the Darius Lemons, I don't know if you saw that, with him tweeting after the game that he wanted to transfer. Just absolutely demoralizing loss to Florida, because it's early in the season, Dan Mullen's first SEC opponent, and Kentucky finally breaks the longest current single-team winning streak for Florida. So that's a really big deal under Mullen.
Yeah, and it was really interesting, that game as a whole, having someone wanting to transfer right after the fact that Florida almost took the life out of Kentucky 2 years in a row. As it looked like we were in for a repeat of last year in Lexington, where Kentucky thought they had it locked up, only to blow it late in the game. How good do you think Kentucky can be going forward? And did we see either one of these teams really be themselves in this matchup?
I don't think we saw a team beat itself exactly. What blew my mind is Kentucky had something like 12 penalties for 114 yards, but they kept simply just moving the ball, and Florida couldn't stop them. Florida's a team that in the past has prided itself on a defense and has suffered from an inconsistent offense. And I thought we saw a little bit of that inconsistency on offense for sure. I thought Kentucky was pretty stout on defense. So it's obviously still early. It remains a lot to be seen in terms of Kentucky, but I think they're one of the top teams in the East so far.
Let's switch it up for Florida. Just how good do you think Florida realistically can be in year one under Dan Mullen after, they did what they were supposed to do and nothing really more against Charleston Southern, and then really kind of laying an egg against Kentucky?
It's way too early to say because I thought they had an incredible performance against Charleston Southern. I know it's Charleston Southern, but Felipe Frank threw 5 touchdowns in the first half, which is absolutely incredible. I thought he played kind of okay against Kentucky. 17 to 39 looks pretty bad, but you want 232 yards and 2 touchdowns, it's all right. He had the interception, which hurt, of course, in the terms of coming back in that game. But what's interesting to me is that they didn't trust any of their running backs. Jordan Scarlett, I think, led them with 7 carries, 25 yards. And their defense, like I said, just didn't look very good against Kentucky. It's going to be interesting to see how they face up against other teams in the East. And I still think that Florida is going to finish middle of the pack, near towards the top even of the SEC East. But they certainly aren't in the top 2 or 3, I would say, in the division if I had to make a prediction.
I want to toss a hypothetical out at you really quick because it's become something that I don't think at the beginning of the season a lot of people would have considered. Let's just say hypothetically, Dan Mullen, we know he's now lost to Kentucky, had that streak lost. In 2 weeks, week 4 of the season, he comes to Neyland Stadium to face fellow first-year head coach at his particular program, Jeremy Pruitt and the Tennessee Vols, a game that most people right now after Kentucky beating Florida are calling a toss-up. Let's say theoretically and hypothetically he loses to Tennessee and what most people would expect, and the Gators lose to Georgia in that rivalry game. What would be the atmosphere down there in Gainesville, and what could Dan Mullen do to salvage his first year if let's play, pretend history, he has a loss to Kentucky, Tennessee, and Georgia in year one?
Oh, yeah, Florida fans would definitely be pressing the panic button, and I would understand why. But, SEC fans know how good of a coach Dan Mullen is. They saw him do really, really incredibly well at Mississippi State, which isn't the easiest task in the world. So, while that first year could potentially be very disappointing for Florida fans, he's obviously still a good hire. That's not the bad season in year one is not going to make me say that Dan Mullen was not a good hire. So I would wait out a couple more years to really press the panic button for Dan Mullen.
We saw 2 SEC versus SEC matchups last weekend. Kentucky, Florida, one. South Carolina, Georgia, the other. And what a lot of people were expecting to be sort of an SEC East potential championship showdown. Georgia easily taking care of the Gamecocks. With that being said, who do you think the number 2 in the SEC East is right now behind Georgia, and just how big of a gap do you think there is between first and second place in the East?
Well, to answer your second question first, I think it's a pretty big gap. But to answer your first question, it's kind of funny because it really could be Kentucky. I think I hinted at that earlier. But again, it's just too early to tell. I'm very interested in Missouri because I love Drew Lock. I would be fine drafting him if I was an NFL GM. That dude can absolutely sling it. The defense has gotten better in Missouri too, because last year that was obviously one of their biggest problems. They played Purdue on the road on Saturday, and they just lost to Eastern Michigan. So I expect them to win that game. But they played Georgia the following week, which is interesting because I think that game could be a shootout. I think that Missouri's offense could keep up possibly with the Georgia Bulldogs, but I'm not expecting a big upset or anything, but I think that game could be close and shock a few people. So Missouri's definitely a team that I'm looking at. Kentucky, obviously, right now does look like the number 2 team in the East. And I still think South Carolina's a decent team. I wonder what would have happened in this matchup if they had played in Week 8 instead of Week 2.
And you're listening to SEC Overdrive here, powered by 3 Point Stance Magazine. Sam Foreman with you, and we're visiting with Saturday Down South contributor Jordan Dajani. Jordan, A&M played great against Clemson last weekend. They've got Alabama coming up in a couple of weeks. Just how can A&M make a run in the SEC West in your mind? They were kind of that 5th to 6th place range team by most people preseason, but seeing what they did against Clemson, does that change your opinion on if they're a contender in the West?
Yeah, I think everyone's impressed with Texas A&M, what they've done so far. Jimbo Fisher definitely has this team on the right track. But, you look at their schedule in the West and just having to play in the West, they still have Alabama, like you mentioned, Auburn and LSU on the docket. So my answer is no. I love this team, though. I love Kellen Mond, their tight end, Jay Sternberger. Kendrick Rogers had a big game against Clemson. But it's going to be tough to get into second or third in the West if you have 3 divisional losses and 4 total losses, if that just ends up happening. Because I really like LSU. I think they have a lot of untapped potential. It's going to be interesting to see how Burrow does as he continues into SEC play. And, of course, I like Auburn, too, who tied/won the SEC West last season. So Texas A&M's just kind of in a tough situation. But, if they played in the East, they could have definitely given Georgia a run for their money, I feel like.
I know we're 2 weeks in. It's still very early, like we both said multiple times throughout this interview, but what surprised you so far for the first 2 weeks of SEC play?
Ole Miss is a team that stands out to me. Jordan Thomas is leading the SEC in passing. Scotty Phillips is leading the SEC in rushing, and A.J. Brown is second in the SEC with 251 receiving yards, I believe. So, I knew this team was going to be interesting to watch, but I didn't expect this kind of offensive explosion. I think what will end up holding them back is their defense, though. I think they're a little inconsistent. Of course, we've only seen 2 weeks of play, so I could be wrong on that. They gave up several explosive plays to Texas Tech in Week 1, and they let Southern Illinois drop 41 on them in Week 2 and still won by 35, which I thought was interesting. Of course, we already talked about Kentucky breaking the streak. That was surprising to me, especially after struggling in Week 1. And, we kind of touched on the Georgia-South Carolina matchup. That was the sexy upset pick for analysts. And I wasn't one of them, but I did think South Carolina was going to keep it close. And Georgia completely blew them out of the water. And, they look like a team who isn't taking anything for granted.
Keeping with the early trend, give me an early report card on some of these first-year head coaches in the SEC East and the West and what you think they've done.
Yeah, I'm cool with giving Jimbo Fisher an A right off the bat. That game against Clemson was very, very interesting. I kept telling people that game might be closer than people expected, and no one believed me. For what that younger offense kind of did against what is supposed to be a top 2 best defense in the country was pretty outstanding, even if they were at home. Of course, Dan Mullen at Florida looks a little iffy. It's still early. However, I know he's a great coach. I would have liked him to have him at Tennessee as I graduated from there. Joe Moorhead looks good at Mississippi State. It'll be interesting to see how the Bulldogs fare in conference play. I think they're kind of around that 3rd to 4th range in the SEC West, possibly 2nd. And Chad Morris, he obviously had that bad loss to Colorado State, of course. And, it wasn't a bad loss because Colorado State's a bad team or anything. I think it's because the Razorbacks let up 17 unanswered points in the 4th quarter. Matt Luke is certainly looking like an answer right now for the Rebels. I know that wasn't the sexiest hire in the world, but it looks like that promotion might work out. I love what their offense is doing, as I've already talked about. And for Jeremy Pruitt, I don't think we've seen really anything. It's been way too early. That West Virginia loss was kind of expecting, that deficit was kind of the range I was expecting. They had a really complete performance against ETSU, and I'm expecting the same thing against UTEP. But how this team competes when they get into conference play will definitely be interesting, and I think it will speak to the toughness that Jeremy Pruitt brings to this program. Are these players, even though they're not as skilled as players on Georgia, are they buying into Jeremy Pruitt? Are they buying into his philosophy? Are they ready to get out there and compete, even if it means they're going to lose?
Before we let you go from this first visit, give us a rundown on what you've got coming up down the pipe over at SDS and toss out all the social media information for our listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're a big SEC football fan, then going on Saturday Down South's website is a must. Subscribe to their feeds, like their Facebook pages. You won't miss anything that happens in SEC football if you're following Saturday Down South on social media. As far as I go, my Twitter name is JD3. That's JDNUMBA3. Go ahead and give me a follow. Hit you with a follow back, and we can talk some SEC football.